The second lesson this morning is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, the 5th chapter. Matthew's summary of Jesus' sermons. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your goodness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Benjamin Sparks of Richmond, Virginia, tells of driving with a Scottish friend come to visit through an historic neighborhood of that town, and they pass an elementary school on whose lawn is posted a sign which proclaims, "This is a drug-free school." And his foreign-born friend is astonished, amazed that something so obviously naive was so displayed. Because, as he put it, if there were no drugs in the school, you didn't need to say so, and if there were, posting a sign only mocked the authority of the principal and teachers whose responsibility it is to ensure that there are no drugs there in the first place. Mr. Sparks goes on to relate that just a few days later, coincidentally, a friend from another city called him and told him of his dismay at taking his first child to kindergarten and seeing placarded above the doors of the entry the words, "This is a gun-free school." It is, he comments, horrible to contemplate that an elementary school should even have to be designated in this fashion. Someone has written that over the years, teachers have been asked to identify the top problems in America's public schools, and in 1940 they identified talking out of turn, chewing gum, making noise, running in the halls, cutting in line, infractions of the dress code, and littering. And when asked the same questions in 1990, teachers identify drug abuse, alcohol abuse, pregnancy, suicide, rape, robbery, and assault. The scene is not always pretty out there. The Index of Leading Cultural Indicators points out that in the last 30 years, there's been a 560% increase in violent crime, a 400% increase in illegitimate births, a quadrupling in divorce rates, and more than a 200% increase in the teen suicide rate. As I say, the scene is not pretty. But I think the real question that needs to be asked is this: what has brought us to this pass? Is it simply that as a people we have grown more rebellious and irresponsible, more cruel and destructive? Or have there been deeper cultural and ideological shifts that underlie and influence this growing lack of civility, this increase in social irresponsibility? And obviously I think there are. The scene is not just one of growing violation of generally accepted moral standards. The scene is one of growing confusion and disagreement about what the moral standards are. The cultural elite, or at least part of it, in media and academia, have convinced vast numbers that morality is mere social convention, that rules are arbitrary restraints imposed usually by the powerful, that real life consists in following your own impulses and desires, that no one has a right to stand in judgment on the behavior of anyone else. So Ted Koppel, speaking before Duke University, can say, in place of truth, we have discovered facts. For moral absolutes, we have substituted moral ambiguity. We now communicate with everyone and say absolutely nothing. We have constructed, again, the Tower of Babel, and it is a television antenna, 1,000 voices producing a daily parody of democracy in which everyone's opinion is afforded equal respect, regardless of substance or merit. So against all this, against not only the irresponsibility and destructiveness, but against the pervading feeling that there are no absolute standards and everybody has a right to his own opinion, I wish to lift up an old, old word this morning, a word which says there is moral law. And it's not opinion or cultural convention or the creation of human beings. It is a law as absolute as the law of gravity. There are absolute moral standards, and everybody knows it. We may talk as if there isn't. We may rationalize and excuse our behavior, but in the last analysis, we all know there are limits. In a recent article in Harper Magazine, a young woman interprets her rather chaotic involvement with sex and drugs and a whole series of men as the result of a background that was too concerned with rules. She writes, many middle-class people, both men and women, were brought up like I was to equate responsibility with obeying rules. And when the rules no longer work, they don't know what to do. So she ends up believing, at least as best I understand her, that real life consists in following your own personal, emotional truth wherever it may lead you. The only thing is, it becomes clear that she too finally reaches her limits because she is not willing to tolerate her boyfriend following his own personal, emotional truth wherever it happens to lead him. I forget the name, but the philosopher said, if someone tells you there are no moral absolutes, don't argue with him, hit him over the head. He will not respond by answering, I understand your need to express yourself in that way, but in my opinion, that may be an inappropriate way to respond to what I have said. He will much more likely say, hey, cut it out, that is wrong. My point is that we all know there are limits we must adhere to, whether we feel like it or not, whether it is convenient at the moment or not, or life together simply becomes impossible. And that is what moral law is finally about. It is not arbitrary restraints imposed on life by sectarian religious authorities. It is not rules handed down by preachers who are afraid that someone somewhere might be in danger of having fun. It is not human opinion or cultural convention that varies depending on circumstance or situation. Morals are the fundamental principles that make human health and survival possible. It's interesting, the biblical writers always associate moral law with the laws of creation. Your law is firmly fixed in heaven, O God. You have established the earth, and it stands fast. Moral law is not unlike the laws of nature. It is part of the structure of things. To be sure, there may be situations where moral principles collide, and we have some difficult decisions to be made. But by and large, the great moral principles remain just that. Moral principles built into the fabric of creation by God. The 10 Commandments, not the 10 suggestions, are the way life together in true human community is constituted, just as the law of gravity is the way the physical universe is constituted. And without honesty and reverence for life and faithfulness in relationship and respect for others' possessions and loyalty to one's heritage, there is no community. And where there is no community, sooner or later there is no life. The late Sid Harris was driving at the same thing when he wrote in a column in the Tribune, modern man will tell you that right and wrong are purely relative ideas. What is wrong in one society is right in another. He will tell you that morality differs in different cultures. He will tell you that it's all a matter of taste, of geography, of degree. In this he is partly right, but he is mostly wrong. He ignores the fact that the same moral truths have existed in every society in every part of the world, that all religions have basically the same ethical code, and that when men violate this code, they destroy the very fabric of civilization. So there is moral law. And it must be written not only in our law books, but on our hearts. The only thing that holds us together is the power of the state. If the only thing that keeps people civil and law-abiding is the threat of getting caught and fear of punishment, then we're in real trouble. We ought to be able to depend upon the state to restrain the more violent and sociopathic, to keep our neighborhoods reasonably secure. But the truth is, We can only live together, especially in a free society, as most of us are self-governing. Which means what? Only as most of us are governed not by whim and selfish impulse, but by conscience, by internalized law we respect as from God. By the way, this is why government can't finally solve the problem. Self-governing people, people who obey implicitly an inner moral code, are the creation of families and religious communities that inculcate that code very early. And if it's not done there, if the internal governor of moral law is not learned early and well, it is very difficult for society to do much later on. One of every 3 American prisoners of war captured in the Korean conflict collaborated with the enemy. This was such a high percentage that the president ordered courses for the military on allegiance and patriotism. And they were written by Robert Byrd of the New York Herald Tribune. And later, Mr. Byrd was asked to comment on his course in patriotism, and he bluntly said, "The effort is not succeeding, and everybody knows it." Mr. Byrd went on to say, "Patriots can be made, for patriotism is a cultivated virtue. But we have learned that its cultivation cannot begin at age 18, unless it's already there. Nor can it be cultivated apart from other virtues, such as courage, fidelity, duty, responsibility, self-discipline, self-sacrifice, which involve a whole attitude toward life." Which leads me to my second point. There is a moral law, and sustained violation of that law destroys our life as community and as individuals. What we desperately need in our time is to reconnect in people's consciousness the relationship between morality and survival, between integrity and life. It's not a matter of an angry parent God punishing us for our rebelliousness. It's a matter of us breaking ourselves against the laws of God. Dorothy Sayers, the English mystery writer, put it this way: the word punishment for sin has become so corrupted, maybe we shouldn't even use it anymore. But by punishment, we really mean the inevitable consequence of man's attempt to regulate his life in a way that runs counter to God's will. Typhus and cholera are a judgment on dirty living, not because God shows an arbitrary favoritism to nice, clean people, but because of an essential element in the physical structure of the universe. The avaricious greed that prompts men to cut down forests for the speedy making of money brings down judgment, the judgment of flood and famine, because that sin runs counter to the natural laws of nature. We must not say that such behavior is wrong because it does not pay, but rather that it doesn't pay because it is wrong. Or the words of Erich Fromm: there are immutable laws inherent in human nature and human functioning which operate in any given culture. These laws cannot be violated without serious damage to the personality. If someone violates his moral and intellectual integrity, he weakens or even paralyzes his total personality. He is unhappy, he suffers. In spite of what he thinks, the problem of mental health cannot be separated from the basic human problem, that of achieving independence and integrity and the ability to love. There is a moral law, and sustained violation of that law destroys us. Oh, but let's be more positive this morning. Put another way, life in obedience to the law written on our hearts leads to happiness and joy, leads to the only real life worth living. Listen to the psalmist: "If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my misery. If I ever forget your principles, I will never do so, for by them you have given me life. Oh, how I love your law." Now, frankly, that's not the song that law students down at Northwestern are singing as they pore over the law books of our society. Here is one who sings about the joy of life lived according to the will of God, about the happiness that comes of a good conscience. Someone has said, a clear conscience at day's end is the softest pillow upon which one can go to sleep. Where's the real fulfillment in life? It's not finally in financial success or marital bliss or pleasurable experiences or peer popularity, as nice as all these may be. The real joy and satisfaction arises out of the life of integrity, the life lived to the best of one's abilities according to the best that is in us. Frederick Robertson echoes the words of the psalmist after some family troubles and job reversals had plagued him for a long time. I know but one way, he writes, in which a man may come through all this unscathed. It is by holding fast to those things which are certain still, the grand, simple landmarks of morality, in the darkest hour through which a human soul can pass. Whatever else is doubtful, this at least is certain. It is better to be generous than selfish. It is better to be chaste than licentious. It is better to be true than false. It is better to be brave than a coward. And I hasten to add, there is nothing in the New Testament and in Jesus that changes this one iota. Do not think I've come to abolish the law. I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Why would he say that? Because frankly, there were some who heard him wrong, who assumed that the word about the love of God canceled the demands of the law of God. The fact is, the love of God he talks about only heightens and intensifies the law. Because you see, in Jesus, the emphasis is no longer just on restraint. The emphasis is not only on what we must not do, it is upon what we must do. For you psychologists out there, it's not only on the superego, but on the ego ideal. Hence the traditional confession of the church. We have done those things we ought not to have done, and we have not done those things we ought to have done. With Jesus, it is not only sins of commission, but of omission that count. Sunday school teacher asked the class what the sins of omission were. One bright young girl responded, "Those are the sins we meant to do but forgot." I heard a Protestant some time ago say they wondered what it would be like to be a Roman Catholic and go to confession every week. What do you confess week in and week out, you know? Thinking, I suspect, about the things he had or may have done wrong. Frank Leahy, coach down at Notre Dame, went to confession every Saturday. And one Saturday, though, it got rather lengthy. And so at the end, the priest said to him, "Frank, check the line." "What about the line?" And he said, "The line? We got 6 new ones. They average 225 pounds. And the priest said, "No, Frank, I'm talking about the line waiting outside the confessional." Perhaps our greatest failure, you and I, perhaps our greatest failure before God rests not with what we have done, but with what we've failed to do with our lives, what we've neglected, what we've never gotten around to. Of love and care for those in need. At least these are the failures that haunt me. And none of us has arrived, but real life, the only life worth living, is the life we see in Jesus, the life that strives to fulfill the law as he did, the life that gives and cares and endures and hangs in there and struggles against all the temptations and stupidities of this world. And of course, not one of us arrives this side of the grave. We're all on a long journey with a long way to go, and none of us is ever in a position to pass judgment on the struggler beside us. This is Boy Scout Sunday, and I like the attitude of the young man who was filling out his application for college, and where it said, "What are your strengths?" He said, "My strengths are sometimes I'm trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, reverent." And then the form said, "List some of your weaknesses." And he wrote, "Sometimes I'm not trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent." He knows himself. Jesus makes the law not easier, but harder, and I'm sure this is why he underlines the importance of our utter dependence upon the love and forgiveness of God. Forgiveness is never excuse. It is the freedom from the mistakes and failures of yesterday so that we can take up the struggle again for one more day. God loves us as we are so that we may become more than we are. Some of you may have read the story of Nian Cheng, a woman in her 80s now, Chinese, who lives in this country as a widow. During the so-called Cultural Revolution in China, she was harangued and harassed and beaten and deprived of home and possession, and then placed in solitary confinement for 6.5 years. Imagine yourself for 6.5 years in a damp concrete cell with no communication with the outside world, barely kept alive with a diet so meager that your gums bleed and your hair falls out. Once she was handcuffed for 11 days until her hands swelled, became infected and bloody. And it was all done to humiliate her and to break her will and her faith. All she had to do was deny it, her commitment to Jesus and his way, and she would have been free in a moment to go back to her family and life again. But she did not. And she did not, she says, because she knew that to deny all she believed would be to destroy something deep at the core of her being, her life, her soul. Out of this experience, she writes, "Is it not true that we all possess some destructive tendencies in our nature? The veneer of civilization is very thin. Underneath lurks the animal in all of us. Now, I suppose if I'd been brought up to worship Mao and taught to believe him infallible, I might have behaved exactly as animals like those guards. But I was not brought up that way, so throughout my imprisonment I turned to my God for strength. In the drab surroundings of the cell, I knew some magic moments of transcendence that I had not experienced even in the ease and comfort of my normal life. But my faith sustained me in these darkest hours of life and brought me safely through privation and sickness and torture and enabled me to live from day to day doing what I know is right. To live from day to day doing what I know is right. What better way to live? What deeper peace than the knowledge that we have sought to be faithful? In the midst of the craziness of this world, what deeper satisfaction, not in how far we've come, but that by the grace of God we have been led to the way which is life, now and forever. If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my misery. I will never forget your principles, for by them you have given me life. Indeed.